Wyoming Territory, 1877. The harsh winter winds cut across the open plains like a knife, slicing through any soul brave enough, or foolish enough, to stake their claim on this unforgiving land. For 26-year-old Wyatt Caldwell, the bitter cold was just another reminder of the truth he'd learned since his parents' deaths 5 years prior. The frontier demanded solitude. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. Wyatt stood at the edge of his property, squinting against the setting sun. His ranch was modest, 500 acres, a sturdy cabin, and 30 head of cattle, but it was his, paid for with sweat and determination. His lean frame, hardened by years of physical labor, tensed as he spotted riders approaching from the east. Visitors meant complications, and complications meant vulnerability. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Boss, looks like the Thompsons finally made it," called his ranch hand, an older man named Frank. "Been wondering if they'd survive the journey from Missouri." Wyatt nodded, adjusting his hat over his sandy brown hair. At 26, he lacked the weathered face of most frontier men. His jaw was strong but youthful, with only a day's worth of stubble dusting his features. Women in the nearby settlement of Laramie found him handsome, but Wyatt kept his distance. Romance meant attachment. Attachment meant pain, and pain was something he'd had enough of when outlaws had gunned down his father and mother for their land and money. "We'll be neighborly," Wyatt replied. "But that's all. The last thing they need is to depend on us. The frontier breaks anyone who isn't self-sufficient." Frank sighed. "Not everyone's meant to face this land alone, son." But Wyatt was already walking toward the barn, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The frontier was no place for softness. A man survived by relying on himself and no one else. That was the code he lived by, the armor that kept him alive. What he wanted, what he needed, was to expand his ranch, secure his future, and never again be vulnerable to the kind of loss that had hollowed him out 5 years ago. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Wyatt allowed himself one moment of honesty. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of night, the silence of his cabin felt less like freedom and more like a void waiting to be filled. 3 days later, a snowstorm swept through the valley, catching everyone by surprise despite the late March date. Wyatt was checking fence lines when he heard it, a woman's scream carried on the wind. He reined his horse around, peering through the thickening snowfall toward the neighboring Thompson property. His instinct was to ride in the opposite direction. Their problems weren't his concern. The frontier tested everyone, and interfering only created dependency. The scream came again, more desperate this time. Cursing under his breath, Wyatt dug his heels into his horse's flanks and galloped toward the sound. As he crested the hill separating their properties, he saw flames licking at the corner of the Thompsons' newly built cabin. A young woman was struggling to control a panicked horse while an older couple, presumably her parents, attempted to douse the fire with snow and blankets. Wyatt rode hard into their yard, leaping from his horse before it had fully stopped. "Get back," he shouted, assessing the situation. The fire was small but growing, feeding on the dry wood of the cabin's corner. "The lamp fell when the horse spooked," the young woman explained, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Her chestnut brown hair whipped around her face as she fought to control the frightened animal. "Father's leg is injured from the journey, and mother can't manage alone." Without hesitation, Wyatt grabbed the bucket they were using and ran to the nearby well. Within minutes, he had organized their efforts, directing the older woman to wet blankets while he tackled the flames directly. The young woman finally secured the horse and joined them, working alongside Wyatt with surprising efficiency. An hour later, the fire was out. The cabin had survived with damage to only one corner, though the interior was smoke-filled and would be uninhabitable until repairs were made and the smoke cleared. "We're indebted to you, young man," Mr. Thompson said, extending his hand. "I'm Edward Thompson. This is my wife Martha, and our daughter, Penelope." Penelope Thompson stepped forward, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes, a startling blue, clear and direct. She was beautiful in a way that caught Wyatt off guard. Not the polished beauty of eastern cities, but something more authentic. At 22, her face held both youth and determination. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and despite the emergency, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "We would have lost everything without your help," she said simply, extending her hand. "Thank you, mister." Caldwell. Wyatt Caldwell. He took her hand briefly, trying to ignore the unexpected warmth that traveled up his arm at her touch. You can't stay here tonight. The smoke alone would make you ill. Edward Thompson sighed heavily. We've nowhere else to go. The nearest town is, you'll stay with me, Wyatt heard himself say, contradicting everything he believed about frontier self-reliance. Just until the cabin airs out. A day or two at most. As they gathered what they needed from the damaged cabin, Wyatt wondered what had possessed him. His home was his sanctuary, his place of solitude. Yet here he was, inviting strangers into it because of one woman's clear blue eyes and steady hands during a crisis. The snow was falling harder as they made their way to Wyatt's ranch, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted in his carefully ordered life. You built all this yourself? Penelope asked the following morning, her eyes taking in Wyatt's cabin. Unlike their hastily constructed shelter, his home was solidly built, with proper windows and a stone fireplace. Wyatt nodded, uncomfortable with her attention as he set breakfast before the Thompsons. Had help with the heavy lifting, but yes, took 2 years to get it right. It's impressive, she said, and something in her voice made him look up from the coffee he was pouring. There was no flattery in her tone, just honest appreciation. We thought we could throw up 4 walls and a roof and call it done. Father's never ranched before. He was a shopkeeper in Missouri. That explains a few things, Wyatt muttered. To his surprise, Penelope laughed. Yes, I imagine it does. We must seem hopelessly unprepared. Her honesty disarmed him. Most Easterners are. The land has no mercy for inexperience. Then we'll have to learn quickly, she replied, a spark of determination in her eyes. Would you be willing to teach us? We can pay, not much, but something. Or I could help around your ranch in exchange. Wyatt nearly refused outright. Teaching them meant entanglement, responsibility, connection, all the things he'd avoided. But as Edward Thompson described their situation, their life savings invested in land they barely understood, their determination to make a new start after losing their shop to debt, Wyatt found himself reluctantly agreeing. 2 weeks, he said firmly. I'll show you the basics. After that, you're on your own. What Wyatt didn't admit, even to himself, was how Penelope's presence had already begun to disrupt his carefully constructed isolation. The way she listened intently when he explained about cattle management, her quick mind grasping concepts her father struggled with, her willingness to tackle any task no matter how difficult. These things forced him to question his belief that softness had no place on the frontier. On the 5th day, as they repaired the Thompson cabin, Penelope handed him nails with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Why did you come out here? He asked suddenly. A woman like you could have married well in Missouri. Penelope's expression grew serious. I had a fiancé once. Thomas. He died in a robbery at my father's shop. She continued working as she spoke, her hands never faltering. Afterward, everything in town reminded me of him. But it was more than that. I realized I'd been living the life others expected, the shopkeeper's daughter who would marry and continue that safe existence. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I wanted more, needed more. When Father suggested Wyoming, I saw a chance to discover who I might become without those expectations. Her words struck uncomfortably close to something Wyatt recognized in himself. Hadn't he also come west seeking a place where he could define himself on his own terms? The frontier breaks most who come seeking reinvention, he warned. Penelope smiled slightly. Perhaps, but it reshapes the rest into something stronger. That night, riding back to his cabin alone, Wyatt found himself wondering what shape Penelope Thompson might take after the frontier had tested her, and whether he would be there to see it. The spring thaw brought muddy roads and the first cattle drive of the season. Wyatt had extended his initial 2-week offer to the Thompsons into regular assistance, telling himself it was merely neighborly duty. The truth, that he found himself inventing reasons to ride to their homestead, was something he refused to acknowledge. Edward Thompson was proving a quick study in some areas, though his Eastern sensibilities still caused Wyatt to shake his head in disbelief. But it was Penelope who truly thrived. She took to frontier life with a natural adaptability that surprised even Wyatt. She learned to ride properly, to mend fences, to predict weather from cloud patterns. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned, but her determination never wavered. You're going to Laramie? Penelope asked one morning in early May when Wyatt mentioned his plans to deliver cattle to the railhead. Need to get these yearlings to market, he replied, adjusting his saddle. Should be back in a week. She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. Take me with you. Wyatt stared at her. It's not a pleasure trip, Miss Thompson. It's 5 days of dust, cattle, and rough men. I know that, she said steadily. But Father needs supplies we can't afford to pay someone else to fetch. I can handle myself, Mr. Caldwell. You've seen that much. He had indeed. Over the past 2 months, he'd witnessed Penelope face everything from snakes to broken equipment with the same calm competence. Still, a cattle drive was different, dangerous, exhausting work. Your father won't approve, Wyatt tried. Penelope smiled. He already has. Said it was high time I saw more of Wyoming than just our little valley. That was how Wyatt found himself riding beside Penelope Thompson as they guided 30 head of cattle toward Laramie, accompanied by Frank and 2 other hands. The arrangement tested every boundary Wyatt had established to keep people at a distance. On the 3rd night, after the others had turned in, Wyatt found Penelope sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The flicker of light played across her features, highlighting cheekbones that had grown more defined since her arrival in Wyoming. She'd tied her chestnut hair back in a practical braid, but a few strands had escaped, framing her face. You should get some rest, he said, settling across from her. Tomorrow's the hardest stretch. She nodded but didn't move. I've been thinking about what you said when we first met, about the frontier breaking anyone who isn't self-sufficient. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. It's the truth. Is it? Her blue eyes found his across the flames. Because what I've seen these past months is different. Yes, the land is harsh, but people survive it by helping each other. The Hendersons shared their seed when ours didn't arrive. The Wilsons helped with our roof. She paused. You've done more for us than we can ever repay. That's different, Wyatt insisted, though he couldn't quite explain why. Is it? Penelope persisted. Or is it possible that your belief that you must face everything alone is just wrong? Her words hit him with unexpected force. Before he could respond, a gunshot cracked through the night air, followed by the panicked lowing of cattle. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. Stay here, he ordered, but Penelope was already moving, grabbing her father's pistol from her saddlebag. Rustlers? She asked, her voice steady despite the danger. Likely. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Frank. North side, he called to his now-awake ranch hand. What followed was chaos. 3 men had attempted to cut away a portion of the herd, and when discovered, they opened fire. Wyatt moved through the darkness with the efficiency of someone who understood violence, returning fire only when necessary. To his alarm, he caught glimpses of Penelope doing the same, not recklessly, but with focused precision, helping to drive the rustlers back while keeping the cattle from stampeding. When it was over, the rustlers fleeing into the night with only 2 cattle, Wyatt found Penelope calming a nervous cow, speaking in low, soothing tones. Are you hurt? He demanded, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head. No, but one of your men is, the younger one. Nothing serious, I think. A graze on his arm. Wyatt stared at her in disbelief. Most women he knew would be in hysterics after such an event. Penelope was as composed as any seasoned rancher, though her hands trembled slightly as she continued stroking the cow's flank. You could have been killed, he said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. Her eyes flashed up to meet his. So could you. So could any of us, any day out here. That's the bargain we make with this land, isn't it? Risk for freedom. Something shifted inside Wyatt then, a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed beliefs. He'd always seen attachment as vulnerability, love as weakness. But watching Penelope Thompson face danger without flinching, he wondered if he'd been wrong all along. Perhaps there was a kind of strength in connection that solitude could never provide. The realization shook him more profoundly than the rustlers' attack. Laramie was bustling when they arrived the following afternoon. After seeing to the cattle sale, Wyatt escorted Penelope through town to purchase her family's supplies. He watched with amusement as shopkeepers who tried to take advantage of a woman alone quickly discovered their mistake. Penelope bargained with firm politeness, never raising her voice but never yielding either. You'd think they'd never seen a woman who can add figures in her head, she remarked as they left the general store. Wyatt smiled despite himself. Most women who come through here are either wives who defer to their husbands or working girls from the saloons. And which category do I fit? She asked with a hint of mischief. Neither, he admitted. You're something else entirely, Miss Thompson. That evening, after securing rooms at the hotel, Wyatt surprised himself by suggesting they attend a social at the local church. Thought you might enjoy some civilization after days on the trail, he explained awkwardly. Penelope's face lit up. I would, though I'm afraid I look more like a ranch hand than a lady. When she emerged from her room an hour later, Wyatt nearly failed to recognize her. She'd somehow transformed her practical riding clothes, adding a borrowed shawl and arranging her hair in a simple but elegant style. She wasn't dressed as formally as the town women would be, but there was a natural grace about her that needed no embellishment. "Will I do?" she asked, a rare uncertainty in her voice. "You're beautiful," Wyatt said before he could stop himself, then awkwardly offered his arm. The social was simple: music, refreshments, conversation, but watching Penelope move through the room, Wyatt saw her in a new light. Here was a woman who could face down rustlers and charm the minister's wife with equal ease. Someone who understood both the harshness of frontier life and the importance of moments of joy within it. When the fiddle player struck up a waltz, Wyatt surprised himself again by asking her to dance. "I thought you didn't approve of such frivolities," she teased as they moved around the floor. "I'm reconsidering several of my positions lately," he admitted, his hand warm against her waist. Her eyes searched his face. Such as whether a man truly can, or should, face this frontier alone. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. As the music ended, Penelope stepped back slightly. "Careful, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. "That almost sounds like you're growing attached to your neighbors." Before he could respond, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. 3 men had entered, rough-looking types who didn't belong at a church social. With a jolt, Wyatt recognized them as the rustlers from the cattle drive. "Penelope," he said quietly, moved toward the back door. Now, but it was too late. The tallest rustler had spotted them, nudging his companions and pointing directly at Wyatt. "There he is, the rancher who shot Jim," the man called out, his hand moving toward his gun. The room erupted in chaos as people scrambled for cover. Wyatt pushed Penelope behind him, reaching for his own weapon, but the rustler was faster. A shot rang out, and Wyatt felt a searing pain along his side as the bullet grazed him. What happened next occurred so quickly that later accounts would differ. Penelope Thompson, shopkeeper's daughter from Missouri, calmly drew the small derringer she'd kept concealed in her pocket since the rustler attack and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the rustler's gun hand, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. In the stunned silence that followed, the sheriff and several townsmen subdued the would-be killers. Wyatt found himself being half-carried to the doctor's office, Penelope at his side, her face pale but composed. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," he managed through gritted teeth as the doctor examined his wound. "I could say the same about you trying to shield me," she countered, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. As the doctor pronounced his injury minor, painful but not serious, Wyatt realized with sudden clarity that his life had been irrevocably changed. Not by the bullet, but by the woman who had just saved him from worse harm. A woman who defied every conclusion he'd drawn about survival on the frontier. The journey back to their valley took longer with Wyatt injured, but by the time they returned, something fundamental had shifted between them. Conversations that once centered on practical matters now drifted toward hopes, dreams, and shared observations about the beauty of the land around them. Yet Wyatt pulled back each time they grew too close, retreating behind the walls he'd built after his parents' deaths. The old belief that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow reasserted itself whenever he remembered the rustler's bullet and how easily Penelope could have been harmed. June brought the promise of summer and new challenges. As Wyatt's wound healed, he threw himself into ranch work, making excuses to avoid the Thompson homestead. But one evening, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, Frank arrived with troubling news. "Caldwell, you'd better ride over to the Thompsons," the older man said grimly. "That crook Harrington's there with some papers, claiming their land is actually his." Wyatt's blood ran cold. James Harrington was a land speculator known for fraudulent dealings, targeting vulnerable newcomers with falsified documents and threats. What about the sheriff? Wyatt demanded, already reaching for his hat. 2 days away in Cheyenne, Frank replied. And Harrington's got 3 men with him. Wyatt rode hard through the gathering storm, rain lashing his face as he pushed his horse to its limits. Lightning illuminated the Thompsons' cabin as he approached, revealing several horses tied outside. He dismounted, drawing his revolver before approaching the door. Inside, he found a tense standoff. Edward Thompson stood protectively before his wife and daughter, facing a well-dressed man flanked by armed companions. "Ah, another visitor," the well-dressed man, presumably Harrington, said smoothly. "We're just having a civilized discussion about property boundaries, while your men keep their hands on their guns." Wyatt observed coldly, moving to stand beside Edward. "That's not my idea of civilized, Mr. Caldwell." Penelope acknowledged him with visible relief, though her posture remained defiant. "This man claims our deed is invalid because the land was already sold to him last year." "Convenient timing," Wyatt remarked. "Waiting until they've improved the property before making your claim." Harrington smiled thinly. "Business is business. I'm offering fair compensation for their misunderstanding. They can take it and leave peacefully or face legal consequences." Edward Thompson's face was ashen. "We invested everything we had." "Your deed is fraudulent," Wyatt stated flatly to Harrington. "I know because this land was part of the Rollins tract until last October. No one owned it before the Thompsons purchased it in November." Harrington's smile faded. "You seem very certain of property matters for a simple rancher." "I should be," Wyatt replied. "Before coming west, I practiced law in Chicago for 3 years, specialized in land disputes." The revelation stunned everyone in the room, Penelope most of all. She stared at Wyatt as if seeing him for the first time. "You're lying," Harrington accused. "Try me," Wyatt challenged. "Take your false claim to court, and I'll represent the Thompsons myself. I still have my credentials. Or you can leave now, and I won't report your attempted fraud to the territorial governor, who, incidentally, was a partner in my father's law firm." The tension in the room stretched taut as Harrington weighed his options. Finally, with a curse, he gestured to his men. "This isn't worth the trouble," he muttered. "There's easier pickings elsewhere." After they'd gone, riding away into the storm, Penelope turned to Wyatt with hurt and confusion in her eyes. "A lawyer? All this time, and you never mentioned it." Wyatt flinched at the accusation in her voice. "I left that life behind when my parents were killed. It wasn't relevant." "Wasn't relevant?" she repeated incredulously. "You've watched us struggle for months, making every mistake possible, when you had knowledge that could have helped us avoid half our problems." Edward tried to intervene. "Now, Penny, Mr. Caldwell has been more than generous." "No, Father," she cut him off. "He hasn't been honest. He's kept us at arm's length while playing at being neighborly." Her blue eyes blazed as they met Wyatt's. "Why? What are you so afraid of that you hide who you really are?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Outside, thunder crashed as if emphasizing her words. "You don't understand," Wyatt said roughly. "My parents trusted people. They believed in the law, in civilization, and it got them killed by men who wanted what they had." He ran a hand through his wet hair. "I came west to leave that vulnerability behind. Here, a man survives by relying on himself alone. And how is that working for you?" Penelope demanded. "Are you happy in your solitude, Mr. Caldwell? Has pushing away everyone who might care about you brought you peace?" Her words stripped away his defenses, exposing the truth he'd been avoiding. His isolation wasn't strength, but fear. Fear of loss, of pain, of the very connection he secretly craved. "I should go," he said stiffly, turning toward the door. "Yes," Penelope agreed, her voice suddenly tired. "I think you should." Riding home through the storm, Wyatt felt as if something essential had been torn from him. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, revealing the loneliness he'd denied for years. July brought blistering heat and drought. Wyatt threw himself into ranch work, avoiding the Thompson property entirely. He told himself they were better off without his interference, that his absence was doing them a favor. The truth, that he couldn't bear to see the disappointment in Penelope's eyes, was harder to admit. Then came the day when Frank rode in with urgent news. Fire had broken out in the dry grass near the Thompsons' place. Without hesitation, Wyatt organized his men, gathering wet blankets and tools before racing toward the column of smoke visible on the horizon. They arrived to find the Thompsons already fighting the blaze, which threatened to engulf their cabin and barn. Penelope was directing efforts with the same calm efficiency she'd shown during the rustler attack, her face streaked with soot, her dress singed at the hem. For hours, they fought the fire together, beating back flames that threatened to consume everything in their path. Wyatt worked alongside Penelope without speaking, their earlier conflict momentarily set aside in the face of immediate danger. As sunset approached, they finally contained the blaze. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and parched, everyone gathered near the Thompsons' well. "Thank you," Edward said simply to Wyatt. "We couldn't have saved it alone." Wyatt nodded, his eyes seeking Penelope. She stood apart from the others, staring at the blackened field that had been their vegetable garden. Without thinking, he moved to her side. "It can be replanted," he offered quietly. "Can it?" she asked, not looking at him. "Sometimes I wonder if anything on this frontier can truly take root." The double meaning wasn't lost on him. "Penelope, don't," she cut him off. "You made your choice clear, Mr. Caldwell. You prefer your solitude to any other possibility." Before he could respond, a rider approached at a gallop, one of the neighbors from further down the valley. "Caldwell," the man called. "Your ranch, there's another fire. Looks deliberate." Wyatt's blood ran cold. "Harrington," he muttered. The land speculator had clearly decided to exact revenge. "Go," Penelope urged. Quickly, he hesitated, torn between the urgent need to save his ranch and the equally powerful desire to clear the air between them. "This isn't finished," he told her, then mounted his horse and galloped away, his men following closely behind. They rode hard, but even from a distance, Wyatt could see the situation was dire. Flames engulfed his barn and were spreading toward the cabin. Cattle bellowed in panic as his remaining hands tried to drive them to safety. For hours, they battled the blaze. Despite their best efforts, the barn was lost, along with the cabin's eastern wall. By dawn, Wyatt stood amid the smoking ruins of 5 years' work, his face grim with exhaustion and despair. "We'll rebuild," Frank assured him. "It's not all lost." But Wyatt barely heard him. Something had broken inside him, not just at the destruction of his property, but at the realization of how empty his life had become. He had built this ranch as a fortress against loss, only to discover that in protecting himself from pain, he'd also walled out joy. As the sun rose higher, an unexpected figure appeared on the road, Penelope Thompson, riding alone, her face set with determination. She dismounted, taking in the devastation with a quick, assessing glance before approaching Wyatt. "What are you doing here?" he asked, too exhausted for pretense. "What neighbors do," she replied simply. "Help each other rebuild." She reached out, brushing ash from his cheek with gentle fingers. The touch broke something in him, the last defense against the truth he'd been denying. "I've been a fool," he admitted hoarsely. "Yes," she agreed, the ghost of a smile touching her lips, "but a well-intentioned one." In that moment, standing amid the ruins of his solitary dream, Wyatt Caldwell finally understood what the frontier had been trying to teach him all along. True strength came not from isolation but from connection, from building something with others that could withstand the harshness of this land. "I don't know if I can start over again," he confessed. Penelope's blue eyes met his steadily. "You won't have to do it alone, unless that's still what you want." The question hung between them, weighted with everything unsaid. For once, Wyatt didn't hesitate. "It's not what I want," he said. It never was. August brought rebuilding, not just of Wyatt's ranch, but of connections throughout the valley. The fire had revealed what Wyatt had refused to see, that a community had formed around him despite his resistance. Neighbors arrived with lumber, tools, and willing hands. The Thompsons were there every day, with Edward directing construction based on his previous experience as a builder, another fact Wyatt hadn't known. And Penelope was a constant presence, bringing order to chaos, her practical nature complementing Wyatt's more detailed planning. Together, they redesigned the cabin to be larger, more comfortable, though neither spoke aloud about why that might be necessary. One evening, as sunset painted the newly framed structure in gold, Wyatt found Penelope alone on the rise overlooking the property. She'd changed in the months since her arrival in Wyoming. The eastern softness was gone, replaced by a frontier resilience that suited her. Her chestnut hair, lightened by the summer sun, was braided simply down her back. Her dress, though clean, bore the marks of honest work. "It's going to be beautiful," she said as he joined her, gazing at the half-built cabin. "Better than before." "Because it's being built with others in mind," Wyatt admitted. "Not just as a shelter, but as a home." She glanced at him curiously. "Others?" Wyatt took a deep breath. The words he needed to say had been building in him for weeks, perhaps even since that first day he'd seen her fighting fire alongside her parents. "I told you once that my land was the only thing that mattered to me," he began. "I believed that possessing this piece of earth was enough to fill the emptiness after my parents died. I was wrong." Penelope turned to face him fully, her expression carefully neutral. "What changed your mind?" "You did," he said simply. "Your courage. Your adaptability. The way you face each challenge without surrendering to fear." He gestured toward the valley spread before them, golden in the evening light. "This land, it's just land without the right people to share it with. I've spent 5 years hiding from connection, convincing myself that isolation was strength. Then you arrived and proved me wrong with everything you did." Penelope's composure wavered slightly. "Wyatt, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish." He took her hands in his. "When I said my land is yours, I meant it as a neighbor offering help. But now I'm saying it differently." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "My land is yours, Penelope Thompson, if you'll have it, and me along with it. I don't just want to give you property or protection. I want to give you my heart, if you'll trust me with yours in return." Tears spilled onto her cheeks as she looked down at him. "All this time," she whispered, "I never wanted your land or your help, though I was grateful for both. I only ever wanted your heart." She pulled him to his feet, her blue eyes shining. "Yes, Wyatt Caldwell. Yes to everything." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, not to a place, but to a person. To the understanding that the frontier wasn't meant to be faced alone, that its harshness could be balanced by the warmth of shared love. Their wedding in October was a community celebration, with neighbors from throughout the valley gathering at the newly completed cabin. Wyatt stood beside the stone fireplace, watching in wonder as Penelope walked toward him on her father's arm. She wore a simple white dress, adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning. At 22, her beauty had matured into something that took his breath away, not just her features, but the strength and tenderness that radiated from within. As they spoke their vows, Wyatt marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The man who had once believed that love was a luxury the frontier didn't allow now understood it was actually the frontier's greatest necessity. "I promise to build with you," he vowed. "Not just a ranch or a home, but a life of shared purpose. I promise to face whatever comes, drought, fire, winter storms, with you beside me, not because I need your help, but because I need your heart." Penelope's voice was steady as she replied, "I promise to stand with you through all seasons. To remind you, whenever you forget, that true strength comes from connection. And to love you, Wyatt Caldwell, through every challenge this beautiful, difficult land presents us." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted seemed to echo across the valley, a sound of community, of belonging, of frontier joy that defied all hardship. Later, as lanterns glowed and neighbors danced in the yard, Wyatt pulled Penelope close beneath the vast Wyoming stars. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming west? Facing all this difficulty when you could have had an easier life?" Penelope laughed, the sound as clear as the creek that ran through their property. "Not for a moment," she assured him. "The frontier showed me who I truly am, and led me to you. What could be worth more than that?" As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of cozy evenings by their fireplace, Wyatt and Penelope Caldwell faced the future not with fear, but with confidence. Their land flourished under their combined care. The Thompson homestead, now managed by Edward with occasional help from his son-in-law, grew steadily more prosperous. And when spring arrived, bringing new calves to the expanded Caldwell herd, it also brought news of another new life beginning. "A baby," Wyatt whispered in wonder, his hand resting gently on Penelope's still flat stomach. "Our child will be born here, in the home we built together. In the community we helped create," Penelope corrected, gesturing toward the other homesteads visible in the distance. Standing on their porch as sunset painted the Wyoming sky in impossible colors, Wyatt Caldwell finally understood the frontier's greatest lesson. It wasn't a place that demanded isolation and hardness of spirit. Rather, it was a teacher that stripped away everything false until only the truest connections remained. "My land is yours," he murmured against his wife's hair. "But more importantly, my heart is yours. Forever." Penelope smiled up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the endless sky. "And that," she whispered, "is all I ever wanted."